Hello, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Presser Law Firm, your asset protection attorneys. In our few minutes today, we want to dive into what has been and continues to be prime interest for many people who want to build their wealth, where many educators, coaches, and consultants would teach you on how to get started or scale your real estate business. Today, we want to talk about protecting your real estate business and the assets. So once again, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. What to expect in today's webinar? Some of our goals that we want to cover in our conversation today. We want to give you, the investor, the peace of mind you need so that you can focus on growing your business and your real estate portfolio, knowing that you aren't unduly exposed to risk and liability. We also want to talk about the key asset protection factors to consider when planning to purchase your first investment property. And we want to talk about some common questions that beginning and seasoned investors ask when they are investing in real estate. And the last thing we'll end off with for today is to dispel some misconceptions circulating the real estate industry. So what makes this topic so important? Well, real estate. Real estate is the cornerstone of the American dream. If you had to ask who cares about real estate asset protection, I would say all of us. At some point in all of our lives, we will either directly or indirectly own a property. And owning a home is a keystone of wealth for both financial affluence and emotional security. Whether you are an active investor, whether you are a passive investor, it's very important for you to consider how to protect your investments. I don't believe anyone works long and hard to accumulate wealth for themselves only to lose it due to not properly protecting themselves. So whether you're a landlord who buys properties for rental purposes, or you're a rehabber, you buy properties, distressed properties for rehabbing and then putting it back on the market to resell. It's important for you to consider how can you protect yourself as a real estate investor. Real estate is one of the heaviest litigated areas of law. Just by virtue of owning real estate, you're exposing yourself to risk and liability. When working with contractors, independent contractors, when you have tenants who can possibly get injured on your property, you have boundary disputes, you have title disputes. A common example, especially in South Florida, this happens a lot. You'll find where there may be a shootout that takes place at a property. Who do you think the injured parties are going to go after? Typically, they want to go with the person that they believe has the deepest pocket. And who do you think they believe have the deepest pocket? The owner of the property. There was a common an example of what occurred in South Florida. There was an intoxicated guest. A friend invited a friend over for like a get together, a party, and he got intoxicated and he ended up leaving his friend's unit, went to another unit. It was a condominium complex, went to another unit and vandalized it while the tenant was sleeping in the unit. There's always risk and liability when you own properties. One of the most common examples that we can think of recent is the Surfside incident that happened in South Florida. Right now, you have tons of lawsuits that are being filed where people who have been damaged as a result of the tragedy, they're trying to find who they can go after to bear some responsibility for the collapse. More than a dozen lawsuits have been filed at this point in time. So if you had to ask what can expose you when you own real estate, anything can expose you. From allowing your child to drive your car, that can expose you. So it's very important for us to consider how are we going to protect ourselves as real estate investors. So are you properly protected, right? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. Tony Robbins once said, success leaves clues. Go figure out what someone who's successful did and model it, improve it, but learn their step. They have knowledge. So I'm a strong believer that we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. that there are a lot of successful individuals, there are a lot of successful people. You can simply look at what they've done to protect themselves and you can model it. Asset protection strategies, they can save you tons of money. Speaking from my own personal experience as a real estate investor, you can actually shorten the learning curve by simply learning from those who have done it before. If you want a peace of mind, you have to consider asset protection. And regardless of your profession, by owning real estate, you're going to be subject to risk and liability. So whether we're going to utilize corporations, limited liability companies, limited partnership and trust, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, it's very important for us to consider all of these factors. So what are some of the key factors for us to consider when investing in real estate? When investing in real estate, it's important to consider how you're taking title to properties. Starting off, many people would title the property under their personal name. It's a very common thing to do, especially nowadays with what we call wholesaling, which is where you would secure a contract to purchase a property and you would assign your rights in that contract to an end buyer, whether that be a fix and flipper or a buy and hold investor. Now, while titling property under your personal name can have certain advantages to it, for example, obtaining financing, less startup fees, it makes it a little bit easier when managing paperwork. But from an asset protection standpoint, you're still exposing yourself to much risk and liability. Now, you may say, how so? Well, let's take a look at an example. Let's say you purchase a property for $100,000 cash and you title the property under your personal name. So my name's Akhenaton and I title it under my name, Akhenaton Pierre. Now, let's say sometime in the near future, I got into a car accident and the other driver that I got into the car accident with sues me, claiming $200,000 in damages. Even with insurance, which a lot of people default to say, I have insurance, so I don't need to worry about putting my property under a company, right? Because the property is listed under my personal name, I'm still subject to the lawsuit. My personal assets are still subject to that lawsuit, as well as any other assets titled under my personal name. So now you may say, well, I have good insurance. We all know insurance companies wouldn't be in business very long if they were to settle every claim that comes their way. So, and not to mention, what if the claim, give me one moment, can I admit somebody here? All right, perfect. What if the claim that the injured party is filing against you exceeds the amount of your insurance? So this is why having entity in the proper structure, corporate structure, is one of the biggest factors as you take title to properties, okay? For many business owners, specifically real estate investors, limited liability companies, also known as LLC, is the ideal entity type to use when taking ownership to property. Now, LLC usually is the default type of entity structure that a lot of people go to whenever they're purchasing a property. In a few minutes, we'll talk about how not all the time is an LLC the best way to structure it, but LLC is one of the best ones to utilize. LLCs were first formed in Wyoming in 1977, and it has become the go-to entity in real estate. Important to note is the fact that LLCs, while they are the default one for most people to go to, depending on how the transaction is structured and depending on what the goals are in the transaction, you may want to consider other structures, right? Let's say you are starting a real estate fund or a REIT, which is called a real estate investment trust. Maybe an LLC may not be the best structure in that instance. You may want to consider a corporation or a limited partnership, which we'll talk about in a few minutes as well. But here's the thing about LLCs. They carry a lot of benefits that other structures don't provide. LLCs are known to be the hybrid between partnerships and corporations. And there also are a lot of significant tax advantages and tax savings and lowering personal liability. LLCs provide their members with what we call protection from limiting their liability, the protection that they would get from claims that come against the entity. Okay, so for example, let's say a tenant were to slip and fall, and that property was owned by an LLC. The tenant wouldn't be able to collect against any personal assets you own simply by virtue of the property being titled under that LLC. Only assets owned directly by the LLC will be subject to any suit or litigation. Members, who are also known as the owners of LLCs, are only liable to the extent of their investment in the company. And this makes LLCs the ideal form of entity for real estate investors. So let's break this down just a little bit, right? I'm looking to start buying properties so I can rent out, or I'm looking to buy properties so I can flip. What's the first step? Well, the first step we would recommend is seek counsel, right? Seek counsel from an experienced attorney, as we specialize in asset protection here at the Cressa Law Firm. You want to talk to the attorney about what are your goals. If you're an investor and you're saying, hey, I want to team up with my family members, with friends of mine, so that we can put some funds together to start investing, the attorney will tell you which is the best entity structure to consider. And as well, we have to consider the geographic location, right? The way you would approach it in Florida might be different the way you would approach it in California, which is one of the most difficult states to form entities. So it's very important as we move forward in our conversation today that if you are an investor and you're looking to buy a property, where many coaches and consultants will say, hey, don't worry about setting up the entity, don't waste your money on doing that, we would advise to the contrary. Why? Because you want to protect your liability. You don't want any other personal assets you have to now be exposed to that risk and liability simply because you chose not to take that extra step of getting an attorney to file the proper paperwork, putting the right operating agreement or partnership agreement for you to make sure that your interest is protected, and not putting you in a situation where the hard money that you've earned, that you've decided to now invest it, to grow it, to build wealth for yourself, is now subject to liability. Okay, let's say you want to become a landlord and you want to buy rentals, right? We always recommend put each property under a different entity. Now, in a few minutes, we'll talk about some of the common questions that real estate investors would ask, but it's very important that you understand that what this LLC does, it shields your liability. And I know, we gave you the legal approach, but let's break it down to common language, right? It protects you. It makes sure that you're not put in a situation where your interest in this property is lost. You buy this property for $100,000. You raised $100,000. It took you years to put this money together. It took you a lot of sweat and effort to put this money together, to now go out there and say, okay, I'm going to set things up for my family. I'm going to set things up for my kids, right? You want to put this under an LLC to protect you, so that if something were to come out, something were to occur, a tenant gets injured, a contractor gets upset with you and says, hey, I'm going to sue you, or even a contractor gets injured. All the time in South Florida, we're hearing situations where contractors on a job site are getting injured for an equipment falling on them. There's risk, there's a lot of liability, but you as the owner, you want to protect yourself, right? And not only want to protect yourself from a personal standpoint, even from your other assets, you want to protect yourself. What do we mean by that? For the example we just gave you as a landlord owner, a landlord would typically have multiple properties, right? By having each one of these properties in a different entity, a different LLC, for example, it allows that if something happens to one property, it doesn't affect the other property. So let's say, for example, you buy property A for $100,000. And a couple of weeks later, you buy property B for another $100,000. And let's say tenant in property A one day is walking and trips and falls, injures themselves, and says, hey, you as the landlord, you had the responsibility to make sure that the property was safe. And they put up a viable claim that now puts you subject to litigation. Okay, because this property is only worth $100,000, this entity that now has an asset worth $100,000, that is the only thing that this tenant has access to. Your other property, now property B, that is as well worth $100,000, is not subject to liability, versus the alternative. Let's say you put both properties under the same entity. So now this entity has assets up worth to $200,000. Now, even where the claim may only be for $50,000 or only for $60,000, you're now tying up $200,000 in litigation, right? So if you keep them separate, while one claim is being pursued under property A, right, it allows you now, you can still do what you need to do in your business with property B or other properties. Another thing for you to consider is the value of these properties. Would you want a couple of $50,000 property with $1 million property under the same entity? A lot of liability, a lot of risk. And this is why we're recommending for real estate investors, and whether you're a wholesaler, whether you're a flipper, whether you're a buy and hold investor, you want to make sure that you have the proper corporate structure to protect your interest. Okay, so this is just a slide showing you guys about what we talked about about LLCs, when they were formed, and how they are the hybrid of partnership and corporation, the different benefits, which we already covered for you. One of the things that we did forget to mention with LLCs is the ease in setting up the LLCs. A lot of people think that LLCs is very complicated to set it up. Here at our firm, we file LLCs daily for our clients. It's not something that takes a lot of effort in doing, but you just want to make sure that it's done properly and has the proper paperwork. So someone would say, oh, I'm only buying this entity. I'm going to put it under my personal name. I don't want to spend the thousands of dollars to go hire an attorney. Okay, I understand that. You want to save a couple $1,000s, but how much money are you investing in this property, right? Maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 50, maybe $100,000. I don't know the amount. It varies, right? What you want to make sure is being done is by having this attorney to draft up, spending a couple $1,000s to draft up the proper paperwork, the ease in setting up this entity will save you so much money. And the beautiful thing about LLCs is that there's also no ownership restriction. So you can have an LLC own another LLC. You could have a corporation own an LLC, depending on your goals, again, and the structure that you're aiming for. When you talk to an asset protection attorney, will tell you which is the best way to set up the ownership of that LLC. Okay. Now, an LLC can either be member managed or manager managed. What differentiates the two is a member managed LLC puts all the operating authority of that LLC in the hands of the members. As we mentioned before, members are the owners of the LLC, whereas a manager managed LLC is an LLC where the owners aren't the one overseeing the day-to-day operations of that entity. You actually can elect a manager. You can even hire a manager who can operate the day-to-day of that LLC for you. What differentiates the two is really control versus ownership. I believe coined by Warren Buffett, he once said, you want to control everything and own, you want to own nothing but control everything. So in other words, as a manager managed an LLC, you can put yourself in a position where the only thing that's being disclosed or the only thing that's being seen by the public is that you manage the LLC, but that you don't own it. And you can layer the protection depending on, again, your goals and what you're trying to aim for. You can layer the LLC to be owned by another entity, an LP, limited partnership, depending on, again, your goals and what you're trying to accomplish, to make sure that you are limiting the risk and exposure as much as possible. All right, so now let's jump into some of the common questions that new investors will typically ask. I want to spend some time here because I believe that by being more practical, it gives you a better grasp as to why it's so important to have asset protection as a real estate investor. One of the first questions, flipping versus landlord. Is there a difference? So to a certain extent, there's a difference between flipping a property and being a landlord of a property, right? As we all understand, if you don't, I'll give you a brief explanation. Flipping a property is where you buy a distressed property, you put some money into it so that you can put it back on the market to resell. Whereas landlording is where you buy a property and you're going to have a tenant move in there and pay you rent on a month-to-month. So when a person flips a property, their focus is trying to earn a lump sum return on their investment. A landlord does the same thing, but they mostly get paid their return over time. So typically their focus is cash flow. From an asset perspective standpoint, the differentiation between a flipper and being a landlord is where a flipper buys a property. Typically, they would try to put as little as possible into that property. What we mean by that is they would utilize financing sources such as hard money lenders, private money lenders, and different, they would maybe pull from a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, or they would get a revolving line of credit so that they can invest in that property. When they pull these lines of credit or get these lenders to come in, they're going to give what they call a mortgage against the property. So that means they're going to use the property as collateral so that they can secure that mortgage. Now, by securing that mortgage, they sometimes have little to no equity in the property, right? Example, buy a property for about $100,000. and I decide to put only $10,000 down and I get a lender to give me a $90,000 loan, that lender is going to have a lien against the property. So now let's say there is a claim that comes against me personally or even against this entity. It will be very difficult to collect against this particular property because there's already a lien on the property. So a flipper typically don't have as much risk as a landlord, even though there's still risk there because there are flippers who buy properties cash. So at that point, they have 100% equity in the property and they have 100% at risk. Whereas with a landlord, typically they want to hold the property for a long time period, right? Maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe for as long as they feel that the market makes sense and they're getting good cash flow from the property. With the landlord, they typically would have way more skin in the game, right? They'll put way much more money in buying their properties, again, because their goal is to get good cash flow. And they would typically go to some of these states where properties aren't too expensive, you know, $50,000, $60,000 properties. And when you buy these properties, you're not dealing with the lender, right? You're buying it all cash. So there's a lot of liability there. You literally have sitting dollar signs available to creditors. So that's the biggest difference between the two. But again, by having it under an LLC, it protects your interest, right? It protects your money. It puts you in a position, and depending on your net worth and where you are in your investing career, you can talk to us so that we can determine whether or not it's important to layer, to create other parent companies to protect the LLC's interest in addition to the money that you've invested yourself. Another question that typically is asked: should I create an LLC before doing my first deal? I would say idealistically, yes. You always want to have an LLC before doing your first deal. Again, a lot of coaches, consultants, and people out there would say, hey, don't worry about it. Just buy it under your personal name, do what you got to do, and you resell and you'll be out of it. You can be liable at an instant, right? An example for you is we have an individual who started investing, didn't even buy the property, but got into contract with a seller. They got under contract under their personal name. Now, some issue occurred and this individual wasn't able to close on the property. The loan fell through and they decided to say, hey, I won't be able to close. They told the seller, hey, I won't be able to close. You can go ahead and take my earnest money deposit. That'll be a wrap. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. The seller was in a situation where they had to sell the property. And one of the provisions in the contract was actually that the buyer is on notice that if they're unable to close on this property, they're allowing the seller to come and pursue them for damages. And that's exactly what the seller did in this situation. Because the property now, because the contract was under their personal name, now the seller had access to all the personal assets. So we would say before you enter into a deal, even when making offer on a contract, I would typically advise that you would put it, the contract under your personal name and or assigns, which allows you to close under an LLC, because a lot of times there may be a really, really hot deal and you don't have time to call your attorneys and say, hey, I need you to draft up the paperwork. I'm about to purchase this property. I need to make sure that it's under an LLC. Sometimes you don't have that time. But what you would do in that instance, you would simply put the contract under your personal name and or assigns, which allows you between the time you enter in the contract and before you actually close on the property, your attorney team can go ahead and create the LLC in the proper state to make sure that you are protected. Okay. Another question, which is becoming one of the most popular things here in South Florida, is the short-term rentals, Airbnbs. Should short-term rentals be under a company? Our recommendation does not matter what type of property it is, if it's a short-term rental, if it's a fix and flip, even if it's your primary home, depending on the state that you're in, there may be other ways to protect it aside from putting under LLC, but you want to put it under an LLC, irrespective of the reason, irrespective of the type of rental that it is, you want to put it under an LLC. Following up to that question, should I title properties under the same company? Responding to this question, we would take a cost-benefit analysis, right? When you put properties under an entity, what you have to understand is what you are doing is you are grouping money together in one place, right? So that the example we gave earlier with the two type of entities, the entity one with $100,000, entity two with another $100,000, is based on the value of those properties. So let's say you now put both those properties under one entity. This entity has an exposure of now $200,000. So you should consider, does it cost more versus the benefit, right? If you have 100 properties and you have 100 LLCs, that's a lot of management, right? That's a lot of management. That's a lot of monthly fees, state tax fees that you have to pay. So you definitely want to consider it. But you would never do such a thing as put a $1 million apartment complex under the same LLC with a single family residence that's probably worth $50,000 or $60,000. So it's definitely a cost benefit analysis. Does the cost outweigh the benefit? One thing I will say, the more properties coupled under the same umbrella, the more risk and liability that you are exposed to. So as you are starting your investment career or you are growing your investment career, you want to consider how many properties you're actually putting under the company. Some people would only couple a certain 100,000. Some people would be willing to do 1 million or 2 under the same company. It's really a personal choice. And as you discuss with your attorney team, your asset protection team, and figure out what exactly you're willing to risk, you also want to consider the mortgages that are on the property, because what's being exposed is your equity in the property, right? So for those who don't know what equity would be the difference of the cash you have invested in the property versus the loans that you have on the property. And that would help you come to a determination whether or not you should have multiple properties under the same company, okay? Now, one of the follow-up questions to that, how will finance change if my properties are in a company? And the simple answer is that financing shouldn't change, right? At the end of the day, what's important to a lender is 3 things: the collateral, your capacity, and your credit. The lender is going to finance the guarantor. 99% of the time, lenders will require for a personal guarantee on the note, on the mortgage, but it's still separate from the equity that you have in the property. So it shouldn't change at all, okay? Another question that is usually asked, does asset protection save me money on taxes? The answer to that is asset protection should be tax neutral, all right? No one should obtain asset protection with the goal of evading taxes. If you didn't know, that's illegal, okay? You can't deliberately avoid paying taxes, but there are some tax saving strategies which real estate is really great for, such as deferred depreciation, deducting expenses, property taxes, insurance, mortgage interest, property management fees. If you don't have a good CPA, our firm could always refer a team to you who specializes in real estate. But to answer the question, excuse me, asset protection is not necessarily being used for the purposes of saving taxes, okay? A follow-up question to that is, why not just title my property under a land trust, okay? A land trust is just like any other trust. It's a privacy management device, and it allows the true owner names to be anonymous. So what does that mean is that a land trust, what it provides you, your identity can't be disclosed to the public unless a judgment or it requires you to disclose it to the public. So it does provide you privacy, but not necessarily protection. So for individuals in this business, in the real estate business, a lot of people, it's common for them to say, hey, I'm just going to buy the property under a land trust. That's great. It gives you the privacy, but it won't give you the protection that you need. A court can always order the beneficiaries to liquidate the trust to satisfy a judgment, okay? It doesn't have built-in asset protection or liability protection. All right, let's continue. So to wrap all this up, there are different levels and degrees to asset protection. What you want to ask yourself is, what are your assets and what are your goals? Depending on where you are in your investment career, you have to consider, right? How am I going to protect these assets? One of the famous phrases the owner of our law firm, Alel Pressure, likes to say is, for every 60 minutes you spend making money, take 60 seconds to figure out how to protect your assets, protect your wealth. You don't build your wealth so that you can lose it to one litigation. You build your wealth so that you can pass it on to your children. So there are levels and degrees to this. But when you have an asset protection team, they can help you assess the threat, assess your assets, assess your vulnerability, and assess the risk. And from there, we'll be able to put a plan together that can make sure that we protect you, protect your wealth, protect your money, and give you the financial security so that you're not putting yourself in a vulnerable state. We're in South Florida. Our firm is based out of Boca Raton, Florida. South Florida is notorious for litigations and claims, especially personal injury when it comes to car accidents. You'd be surprised the number of cases that come of people who simply did not take the extra step to see how can they protect their entire portfolio. You'd find people with hundreds of properties and all of it would be under one LLC or all of it would be under their personal name. You want to put yourself in a situation where you can grow. And by having the proper asset protection team, it allows you to have the individuals and the team behind you to ensure that you are structured in the proper way and the way to ensure that there's no vulnerability and that one litigation would not wipe you out. Okay. I want to give you the opportunity, if you have any questions based on what we talked about today, you can reach out to us. There's different ways where you can engage with us. You can schedule for us to either do a speaking engagement or a webinar for your team or for you. You could sign up for our weekly newsletter. You can also request copies of our asset protection books, or you can schedule a complimentary preliminary consultation at our office. Okay. I want to thank everyone for your time and for watching. Again, it's all about protecting your wealth. So if you're a real estate investor, a newbie investor, a seasoned investor, you want to figure out how can you protect your interest in your properties. I want to thank everybody for coming on. We truly appreciate it. You can connect with the Presser Law Firm on social media. Follow us on our weekly blog posts. We're here doing these webinars weekly. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out so we can talk about your asset protection and estate planning goals. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.